Well, adaptation is really just the process or processes of adjusting to current and expected impacts of climate change. So really the goal is to help minimize the harms, and there are many types of harm that climate change is causing. So when we say harm, what kind of harm are we talking about? Well, there's damage to natural environment, and those are the things that we all see day to day. Forest fires, floods, landslides, sometimes droughts. There's economic and financial loss, where again, farming systems are damaged, crops don't grow the way they're supposed to. There's social and health related risk, right? Too, if there's forest fires, it has impact on people's health. So it's causing a lot of damage. It's costing a lot of money, and as I said, there are parts of the world now, certainly North America, that are no longer insurable. So that's a huge impact. And I think a lot of, especially people working in climate action, they thought, well, we can't give up the fight on reducing emissions. So let's keep the focus on reducing emissions or on mitigating our emissions, the shift to clean energy and that sort of thing. But I think now there's a recognition, you know what, we're not doing it fast enough. And the world is heating up and natural disasters are getting worse. Insurance claims are just skyrocketing. So we've got to do both. And I think, as you know, and most observers know, the people that are paying the highest price for all these disasters, it's usually the poorest and the most vulnerable. A number of studies have said for every dollar you invest in adaptation, you save $10.
It's like a tenfold benefit.
A tenfold benefit, yeah. So we know that investing, it will pay dividends down the road.
Halo cendekia iklim, selamat datang kembali di EKONIKLIM Podcast bersama saya Ira Purnomo. EKONIKLIM ini adalah sebuah program yang dibawakan oleh Climate Policy Initiative, di mana kita akan bicara mengenai perubahan iklim dan kaitannya dengan ekonomi dan keuangan. Sebelum-sebelumnya ini kita sudah banyak bicara mengenai mitigasi iklim, yaitu bagaimana mengurangi laju perubahan iklim, mengurangi emisi gas rumah kaca, dan bertransisi ke energi bersih. Nah, hari ini kita ingin bicara sebuah topik yang sedikit berbeda, tapi kurang mendapat perhatian, yaitu adaptasi iklim. Kenapa sih adaptasi iklim itu penting? Well, karena sebenarnya dampak perubahan iklim itu sudah kita rasakan setiap hari. Di Indonesia, kita sudah mengalami kenaikan permukaan air laut. Lalu ada banjir yang semakin sering terjadi, kebakaran hutan dan lahan, kekeringan, dan juga banyak cuaca ekstrim lainnya. Jadi kalau misalnya mitigasi itu lebih mengenai pengurangan laju perubahan iklim, pengurangan emisi, adaptasi itu adalah bagaimana kita menyesuaikan diri supaya manusia dan ekosistem bisa bertahan. Dan juga bahkan memanfaatkan peluang untuk memperkuat ketahanan dan juga pertumbuhan ekonomi. Untuk membahas topik ini secara lebih mendalam, hari ini kita mengundang tamu spesial dari University of Waterloo, Canada, Bill Duggan, Project Director dari FINCAPES, yaitu Flood Impacts, Carbon Pricing, and Ecosystem Sustainability, sebuah program yang dijalankan di Indonesia oleh University of Waterloo dan didukung oleh pemerintah Kanada. Bill memiliki pengalaman bekerja di bidang international development selama lebih dari 40 tahun. Ia telah memanage dan juga memberikan technical assistance ke berbagai inisiatif pembangunan, termasuk proyek-proyek yang didanai oleh United Nations, Millennium Development Corporations, Asian Development Bank, Global Affairs Canada, dan lainnya. Yuk kita sapa tamu kita. Hi Bill, how are you today?
Hi Ira, I'm great, thanks. How are you doing?
Good. So welcome back to Jakarta.
Okay, it's always great to be here.
And welcome to our studio, EKONIKLIM.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, so I have briefly introduced you to our audience, but could you please elaborate a little bit more about FINCAPES, what it is, and how it has supported Indonesia?
Okay, well, FINCAPES, as you said, it's a project that focuses on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. It's funded by the Government of Canada through Global Affairs Canada. I work for the University of Waterloo. We actually developed the project collaboratively with the Government of Canada. Our job is to work with Indonesian stakeholders to implement the project. What does FINCAPES do? It does three somewhat distinct things, but some of them are mutually reinforcing. We are working with the Purnomo Yusgiantaro Center to help set up a center of excellence for applied research on climate finance policy, with the hope that we can make some useful contributions to discussions and to help support and accelerate the energy transition in Indonesia. That's the first component. The second component, we're partnered with IPB University in Bogor, of course, and we're working with them, again, helping to set up a center of excellence there on applied research on nature-based solutions, with a particular focus on conservation and restoration of mangroves, and also peatland and peat forest, or lahan gambut in Indonesian, and also with some emphasis on biodiversity conservation. So we're doing a lot of in-field experimentation with them, along with supporting applied research and those kind of things. The third component focuses on flood risks and potential loss and damage due to floods. And specifically, we're looking at doing modeling of not only what flood risks look like now, but looking ahead as the climate continues to warm up. Okay, and as storms and precipitation tend to, from time to time, become more intense and of a longer duration. So we want to do modeling of, if we look at a plus 1.5 world, what do the flood risks look like and what would the loss and damage be? And if we look at a plus 2.5, plus 4 world, we all hope we won't get there, but what would potential loss and damage be? And then what kind of decisions and investments do government and industry communities need to make to try and adapt to, and of course, prevent and mitigate those potential damages. So in a nutshell, that's what the project does.
That sounds really great. And those 3 points, I think, would be really useful for Indonesia as well. So now let's get into the point of adaptation. Could you please tell us a bit more about climate adaptation, what it is, and why is it increasingly important nowadays?
Okay, well, adaptation is really just the process or processes of adjusting to current and expected impacts of climate change. As you said, climate change, global warming seems to be accelerating, and with it, the impacts of climate change. So really, the goal is to help minimize the harms, and there are many types of harm that climate change is causing, and also to take advantage of new and emerging opportunities. So when we say harm, what kind of harm are we talking about? Well, there's damage to natural environment, and those are the things that we all see day to day. Forest fires, floods, landslides, sometimes droughts. There's damage to man-made infrastructure, again, where bridges are washed away, highways are flooded, that kind of thing. There's economic and financial loss, where, again, farming systems are damaged, crops don't grow the way they're supposed to. Again, businesses are inundated with floods, and then they can't operate their budget. There's social and health related risk, right? Too, if there's forest fires, it has impact on people's health. In some cases, there's like even a loss of insurability. We see that, like in the States, we see that in California due to forest fires. A lot of insurers are no longer interested in offering fire insurance. In Florida, we see it, but it's because of floods. Okay, but again, they're exacerbated by climate change. And we even see refugee flows, which are being pushed and accelerated by climate change. We see a lot of the refugees that are heading to Europe out of Africa. It's because of the environmental breakdown, really, or rapid changes in the environment. So those are the different types of harm that are exacerbated by climate change. But there's also opportunities. There are opportunities now to make farming systems more sustainable, to use different approaches, different farming practices. There are opportunities to better protect our coastlines, and that can also involve restoring or protecting mangroves, which have lots of co-benefits we can talk about. There are lots of opportunities to regenerate ecosystems, whether it's degraded forests or peatland area that's been drained and dried out, and it can be the natural hydrology can be restored, and then there are lots of benefits that come from that. It can be producing hydrogen fuel, whether it's green hydrogen that comes right out of the earth, or whether it's blue hydrogen we take off of fossil fuels, and then that gives us a very low or almost zero carbon energy source. So there's lots of opportunities in terms of shifting to cleaner, cheaper, and more local energy sources. So a number of kinds of opportunities.
Well, thank you so much for breaking that down. So why is there more emphasis now on climate adaptation nowadays?
Well, that's a good question. You hinted at it. I think to a certain extent, the world has kind of slowly and begrudgingly shifted towards more of attention on adaptation. And that, as you say, because we're seeing more frequent and more severe natural disasters. Now, we say natural disasters. Some people would say, well, they're not that natural. It's because of the things we're doing that are causing more floods, causing stronger tornadoes, bigger storm systems. But we'll stick with the name natural disasters. So it's causing a lot of damage. It's costing a lot of money. And as I said, there are parts of the world now, certainly North America, that are no longer insurable. So that's a huge impact. So I think we recognize that we have to. For a long time, most climate activists, the people that are going to the big COP meetings, the UNFCCC, and that the focus was on mitigation, rightly so, because we all said we've got to reduce, our carbon emissions. The world's getting hotter. That's what we need to have the focus. And I think a lot of, especially people working in climate action, they thought, well, we can't give up the fight on reducing emissions. So let's keep the focus on reducing emissions or on mitigating our emissions. The shift to clean energy and that sort of thing. But I think now there's a recognition. You know what? We're not doing it fast enough. And the world is heating up, and natural disasters are getting worse. Insurance claims are just skyrocketing. So we've got to do both. And I think, as you know, and most observers know, the people that are paying the highest price for all these disasters, it's usually the poorest and the most vulnerable. It's hardest for them to insulate themselves from it, and it's much harder for them to bounce back, to recover. So for that reason, we have to focus on adaptation as well. So there's been more focus on loss and damage, but again, actually, like the Vanuatu, some of the low-lying and small island states of the Pacific, they were pushing for focus on loss and damage since about 1991, 92, since the initial COP meetings, but nobody wanted to hear it. Okay, and then as we've moved forward, now we'll have COP 30 this year. There were certain parties that don't want to talk about it because there's the talk of reparations. We didn't cause. Some of these countries are saying we didn't cause the damage, but look what's happening to our environment. We think there should be some reparations, and that, of course, it's a sensitive thing, and a lot of people would like to skirt around that. So I think that's another reason that loss and damage, it really didn't get on the radar screen of the COP meetings until the last couple of years, and it's still a sensitive topic. Yeah, and I think the other thing is that we now realize that the negative impacts of climate change, on weather, on farming systems, on agriculture, infrastructure, they're also politically and economically destabilizing. We're realizing that, it's economically it can be disastrous. And as I said, there's refugee flows due to, environments that are no longer suitable for, the kind of farming that was done. So there's lots of reasons for the focus on adaptation. But I think we really were sort of pushed into it, and now we realize there's no escaping it.
Well, great. I think this is really clear how climate adaptation means a lot, and that it matters globally. But now I want now to focus closer to home. Why do you think adaptation projects are urgently needed in Indonesia, and which parts of Indonesia are most at risk?
Okay. Well, I think one of the reasons it's regionally urgently needed in Indonesia. Indonesia has been identified as, in the top 3 or 4 countries in the world that will be impacted by climate change. Many areas are low-lying. A lot of the population of Indonesia lives close to the coastlines. As sea levels rise, as storm surges become more severe, it's going to affect many parts of Indonesia. Indonesia is also subject to landslides. If we get heavy rainfall uphill, all of us who lived in Jakarta, we know what happens when there's too much rain up on the mountains, and then 4 or 5 hours later, it can be a big problem down in Jakarta. So it's very important. It's very important for farming systems in Indonesia, for infrastructure. Okay, so all those reasons. It's just things are getting worse. It's not it's speeding up. So it's wise to start making plans now. As to where. Just about everywhere. Coastal areas are sort of the obvious place, because you get coastal storms and things like that. But there are degraded ecosystems. I think there's massive areas of peatland and forests have been degraded. I was just in Samarinda. Because of various industrial activities there, the watersheds aren't absorbing water the way they used to, so you get the runoff. And if you get heavy rain in Samarinda, an hour later you've got flooding in the city.
And I think that really highlights how vulnerable Indonesia is, especially in certain regions as well, even though we face all these problems from Sabang until Merauke, right? But now let's turn into solutions. Could you share a little bit of examples of climate adaptation projects in Indonesia that are not just protecting communities, but can also generate revenues?
Okay. Yeah, there are adaptation initiatives that generate revenues, but I think often when we look at profitability, it's sometimes too narrow a definition. I think if we're looking at profitability or return on investment, um, sometimes it's not looking at the long-term implications of non-investing in adaptation. So it's a number of studies have said for every dollar you invest in adaptation, you save $10. Okay, because again, if you spend a certain amount of money to protect, say, a coastal area, versus when it's inundated and there's a lot of damage and it washes away either the breakwaters or the roads or the businesses, it costs an awful lot of money and there's a lot more human suffering when that happens. So yeah, in English we have a saying, a stitch in time. If you have something that's torn, if you sew it now, it'll save you 10 stitches later. Okay, and it's very much that way for adaptation.
Yeah, it's like a tenfold benefit.
A tenfold benefit, yeah. So we know that investing, it will pay dividends down the road. But there are examples of projects like, say, if you are preserving or restoring ecosystems, like it could be peatland, it could be terrestrial forests, it could be mangroves. There are certain environmental services that provides, like as we move into carbon credit markets and biodiversity credits, there's opportunities to sell those positive impacts on the environment. Also fish stocks. If we look at restoring or preserving mangroves, it's going to be good for the fishing industry and for fish stocks. So there's lots of opportunities where you get many co-benefits. The problem is, for a long time, we haven't truly put a value on nature. We just took it as something free that we could just take and take and take. Now we realize that nature's worth a lot. Okay, and if we allow our natural systems, our ecosystems to break down, it starts to cost us a lot of money, and it can be quite hard to recover. Like we're doing mangrove restoration and peatland restoration. It's expensive and it's difficult. So you're much better off to spend your time and effort and you invest in protecting those ecosystems upfront, rather than having to try and fix things after the fact.
I think that's really interesting how you look at this profitability and return on investment differently, right? Because in these types of projects, they bring different types of benefits, not directly like revenues, profits, right? So I think that's really interesting. And also we know that not every project has the luxury of creating revenues, right? So many adaptation efforts, they cannot do that. And in your view, is there a way for the government to transform non-revenue generating adaptation projects into the ones that can create value?
Okay. Well, as I said, I think the case of where, for instance, forest concessions, peatland areas, if particularly private sector, if they're allowed to sell carbon credits and biodiversity credits, that's a way they can preserve those forests rather than cutting them down. I've visited some in West Kalimantan, where previously they had those forest concessions. They wanted to cut down the wood and take out as much as they can. Now they'd rather preserve it, and they'd rather switch to an environmental services approach where they can focus on conserving and improving the ecosystem, and then selling primarily carbon credits, but down the road, ideally biodiversity credits as well. Okay, so there's an example where it's more sustainable, and you can perhaps in the long run make a lot more profit by preserving the environment.
Okay, can I go a little bit deeper on the carbon credit chart? Like,
sure.
What are the challenges and the opportunities for Indonesia for carbon credits and in forests and mangroves and peatlands?
Okay, and even in seagrass and blue carbon. Well, in Indonesia, as you're probably aware, it has huge potential, huge, because Indonesia has a lot of forests has been lost, but there's still a lot there. For mangroves, Indonesia is in the top 2 or 3 in the world for mangroves. It has huge areas of peat forests and peatland. Seagrass, obviously, so much coastline, so fantastic opportunities. The issue is, around the world, over the last 5 years, there was a bit of a rapid push and a bit of a gold rush for selling carbon credits, but the integrity of them in many cases was very questionable. And there are some certain international standards, Vera, gold standard, but sometimes those weren't even as consistent or as dependable as they should have been. So rightly so, Indonesia's been looking at it very carefully, and the former Ministry of Environment and Forestry, I remember Ibu Siti, and she was very cautious about that, because if Indonesia wants to develop and operate a dynamic carbon credit market with both the voluntary one, where that would be selling carbon credits on the open international market, but also achieving the nationally determined contributions that the government has agreed to as part of the Paris Agreement. You want to make sure that those carbon credits are really worth something. So understandably, the government has taken a few steps back, and now I know they're working very hard with a number of parties, including Gold Standard and Verra, and that, to identify the criteria for how can we be sure, how do we monitor, verify, and report on carbon credits in a dependable way, so that it's really worth something, and that there's no double counting, that kind of thing. So I think, and that's not easy work, but I know Indonesia is moving forward on it. I think we'll hear a lot more news on that soon. Singapore is making very quick headway on carbon markets, and now has agreements with 6 or 7 countries. So tons of opportunity for Indonesia. It's just a matter of getting all the right pieces in place.
So huge opportunity. It's just a matter of time, let's say, to get everything in place and work on the integrity and measurement and verification.
Yeah, and it's not easy stuff. But from everything I hear, the government's getting close, and I think we'll be seeing more momentum very soon.
Now, do you think there's other adaptation initiatives that can attract funding and potentially generate profits?
There are. I heard of one yesterday where a major beer company in Indonesia is actually funding for restoration of bamboo forests, because that helps improve the water retention and the quality of water on that island, which they need to make their product. So there was a case where there's a synergistic relationship between, environmental preservation and conservation and running a profitable business. Okay, so that's one example. Again, I think there's lots of examples for forests, for mangroves. Those are the ones that come to mind to me. In terms of the funding, there's private parties that come in, like, airlines need to offset. Many companies want to offset their emissions, and it's hard for them to do it. Even some countries want to offset the emissions, so that, Indonesia potentially could sell a lot of credits on either the voluntary carbon market or through, as I said, to comply with promises for the Paris Agreement. But I think there's opportunities for, lots of industries and businesses that they're willing to engage in, like, CSR, corporate social responsibility. They want to give back. They want to give back to the country, give back to the community. There are philanthropic organizations that are interested and happy to do those kinds of things. So lots of opportunities, I think. But again, I think everybody wants to know that they're really investing in something real that's going to generate real results.
And I think that also raises another challenge. So there are also projects that may never generate revenue at all, but they're actually crucial for resilience. So how do we finance those projects? And do you think there are any creative ways to fund or finance these types of projects?
I think those are the ones that are going to need, help from philanthropic organizations, again, corporate social responsibility, ESG funds. Sometimes the multilateral banks, like the World Bank, the ADB, they have funds for those kinds of things. But they're definitely tougher. I think you're not going to get private capital in there if they see it as risky. So it's got to be, parties, whether it's government or industry, that are just happy and willing to do, something that's good for the planet and good for us.
I see. How is it done, like in Canada? Do you have any example?
They have a lot of business interests. They're profitable. They have money, and they're, and they have a foundation that's their role, is to either support social or economic or sometimes environmental causes. And so they're always looking for good things to do. A good example would be like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? Around the world, they're looking for really good initiatives that can help, leverage positive change. So, and that's just one example.
Okay, I see. I think you already covered like the main points, like the main sources. There's the CSR, the ESG funds, private donors, and philanthropic organizations, right? But I think adaptation also doesn't have to stand alone. Some climate projects can also address both adaptation and mitigation at the same time. So could you give us maybe some examples of projects in Indonesia that deliver these kinds of co-benefits?
Sure. I think mangrove restoration is a good one. Okay, mangrove restoration, mangroves are very important for fish stocks and for local biodiversity. So as soon as whether you preserve it or you help restore it, it's going to help in terms of, um, increasing local fish stocks. You're going to get better biodiversity with birds and all kinds of other flora and fauna returning to the area. So that's positive. There will be opportunities for non-wood forest products, other things that can be harvested from mangroves. And we know that we do some work on restoration in Lampung, and we're just about to start some in Jambi. There are many, short of not cutting down the mangroves to produce firewood or charcoal or something, there are many other products that you can sustainably harvest from the mangroves that can help people earn a livelihood. So that's an example. I'm trying to think, with peatland, same type thing. Right now, we're just launching into a peatland restoration project in Jambi, and there we're going to have an emphasis on agroforestry. Okay, so we want to restore the natural hydrology, but at the same time, we realize that the local community, they still need to make money and to produce food. So it'll be a mixture of, there'll be some timber trees we produce, but there'll also be fruit and nut bearing trees, and then there'll be other products like pineapple. Okay, so it's a mixture again, because I think, as we all know, they're not going to protect and preserve the environment if they can't make a living. So you have to have both. You have to have environmental benefits and you have to have economic benefits for the people that are looking after it.
How about and also nature-based carbon credits as well?
Mm-hmm. Sure, absolutely. Again, it's still, we're still building up momentum there. There have been examples, of course, already. Some major carbon credit projects in Kalimantan and that did quite well. There were some bumps along the road, but it certainly showed that approach can work very well in Indonesia.
What was it in Kalimantan? Was it in the forest?
That was, yes. Yeah, I believe it was the one that's best known as the Renbaraya project. And I know there was sort of a hold put on it last year, but my understanding is it's up and running again. Okay. But again, there was questions about ensuring that, the credits that were being sold and traded were real. And I think as, monitoring and measurement and reporting gets better, that'll only get.
Is it the same with biodiversity credits?
Biodiversity credits, it seems like Indonesia is still moving into that. Okay, and even around the world, we see that the indicators for measuring biodiversity, and it's understandable, right? Ecosystems are also different, even in Indonesia, as we know. If you go from Aceh to Papua to NTT, the ecosystems and biodiversity is very different. So it's a matter of identifying what are the indicators, how do you really measure it, and then report on it. And so it's tricky. Like Indonesia has the Indonesia Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan. It has some high-level indicators for measuring it, but I think the Ministry of Environment right now is working on trying to get down to some micro-level indicators.
Well, I think those are really great quota benefits. And speaking of them, peatlands and mangroves, I want to go more into that because they're often called as Indonesia's climate treasures. And they can store massive amounts of carbon while also protecting the coastal communities and the coastlines. But we also know that restoring and conserving them is also challenging. They're not easy. So what do you think are the main challenges?
The first thing is it's expensive. It costs quite a lot. We've done some trials of mangrove restoration via a sort of a kind of traditional approach of, finding the right species, indigenous species, and then replanting, if you're lucky, most of it grows, and sometimes you have to do some filling in and that kind of thing. But it's tricky. It costs a lot of money, like probably about at least $4,000 per hectare. And that's not involving all like the various management costs of trying to get it done. It's time consuming and it's really hard work when you're talking about mangroves. And then you've got to be lucky. If the hydrology isn't quite right, you're not going to get a very good survival rate. So it's complicated and it takes a lot of work and it takes a bit of time. In terms of peatland, again, the hydrology has to be right. In many cases, peat forest areas the water's been drained for, because people wanted to harvest the wood and things like that from it, or maybe wanted to use it for alternative purposes, like maybe palm oil production and things like that. So the first thing you need to do really is to restore the water table, and then you can go back. You're going to get more natural regeneration of the kind of species, flora and fauna that are natural there, and then you can still do some economically productive activities, but you need to do it in balance with nature. So it's expensive, it's complicated. Working with communities, some of the communities we work, they have a particular approach they like to take for restoration, whereas there are different approaches. You could take an ecological approach, which sort of just relies on nature to kind of regenerate on its own more, but that may not match with the expectations people have, where maybe they had a business of having tree nurseries and selling the trees, or getting the contract to plant the trees. So they may not be as supportive of a more natural regeneration approach. So there's biophysical challenges, and then there's social cultural ones as well.
Okay, what are they? The social cultural.
The social cultural. Well, I'll give an example. Like we've worked in places where, as I said, people are willing to sort of do a traditional approach where you identify the best suited species, and then you spend a lot of time planting it and then replanting it where it hasn't grown. But in some cases, we're seeing it may be a lot more efficient and cheaper to use an ecological approach, where you actually collect propagules, what we collect seed pods and things like that for the proper species, and then you just disperse them and you let nature do its thing.
Oh,
okay, so it's
more
not,
natural.
Yeah, more natural. So
process.
Not nearly as much human intervention, but it takes a bit more time. Okay, and it doesn't generate as much employment.
I see.
Okay, and so of course, understandably, the people say, well, that may not be as attractive.
Yeah, true.
And then sometimes they're just working within the Indonesian land classification categories. It may not be categorized in an area that can be social forestry, or maybe it's a protected forest area. So there's all those legal considerations in terms of what can you do there legally, and then sometimes those are probably the major ones. Sometimes there's conflicts between adjacent communities over who actually controls that, or who has the rights for doing certain things, not harvesting products and things like that. So there are biophysical challenges, and then there are many that are sort of around jurisdiction and local expectations.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about the human intervention part, since it can actually create more jobs, right? Mm-hmm. So how much of opportunities are we talking about here in terms of like job opportunities when we have these kinds of conservation projects?
Okay. I can't give an exact number. But I think it could be huge as long as you have the funding for it, right? I mean, I think, as we know, we had the BRG Badan Restorasi Gambu dan Mangrove, right? I forget which. So the National Mangrove and Peatland Restoration Agency, right? Which is now, I think, a lot of those tasks have been reabsorbed into either the Ministry of Forestry or the Ministry of Environment. But they had huge targets of something, I think it was 1.6 million hectares of peatland and 600,000 hectares of mangrove. Those are huge national targets. It's great that they exist, but very hard to achieve. It's expensive. You need a lot of people to do that work. So I think it's possible to find people to do the work, but you've got to have the financing.
So yeah, I mean, it's expensive, but it will bring a lot of opportunities, of economic opportunities, job creation.
Sure. Yeah, and again, when if we do the sort of the more holistic looking at profitability, what are we getting back from those, in terms of natural benefits? It's a really good investment. And especially if you're selling carbon credits and biodiversity credits, it can be a really good paying proposition. But it's a matter of getting all those pieces in place.
I see. So yeah, I mean, so even though we face challenges, as you say, biophysical challenges, socioeconomic challenges, but we still have to remember that the opportunity is huge. So we still have to move forward.
It really is, but it's a matter of, for all of us humans, we're creatures of habit, right? So it's shifting our paradigm. Rather than chopping down that tree, you can actually do a lot better by protecting that hectarage and later selling carbon credits or biodiversity credits or harvesting other products off of it.
Yeah, that's true. And one more related issue here is forest and peatland fires. Mm-hmm. They cause both local disasters and also global emissions. Mm-hmm. Would you say that preventing these fires is also an adaptation activity that provides co-benefits?
Absolutely. And it's a really, really important one. We see it, well, I think we all know about the peat fires that Indonesia sometimes experiences. It causes problems for the people in the area. It even causes problems in Malaysia and Singapore, right? And sometimes, tension in international relations. We have that in Canada right now. In Canada right now, we have over 200 really large forest fires. Many of them, at least half, out of control because they're so big. we either have to let them burn out or hope that we get a change of weather. And that's having impact in Canada. We're getting, really poor air quality. It has impact on tourism. Communities have to be evacuated, and we're even getting complaints from the Americans that it's ruining their summer. So absolutely, and then of course there's the loss of the forest. The loss of all the wood and all the economic benefits of that. There's loss of biodiversity and flora and fauna. Health related issues. My sister lives in the eastern province of Canada. There's fires nearby. You have to wear N95 masks, just like we all did during the pandemic, because it's not good to go out. So huge impacts. Tourism is impacted. So yeah, for lots of reasons, it absolutely makes sense for us. California, parts of Western Canada now, people can't get fire insurance for their house. So if you have an industry or you build a house, if you can't get fire insurance, you may not get the loan from the bank because they're going to say, well, no, if it burns down, we lose our investment. Yeah. So it has huge impacts.
So I think the cost of preventing fires is actually cheaper than the cost of inaction, right? Because the cost of inaction, as you say, it causes so much disasters.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a major electricity utility in California. They had some sparks that came off some of their cables and things like that. The forests were extremely dry due to extended droughts, probably due to climate change. The lawsuits that they faced were so huge that utility went completely out of business. They just could no longer afford to they could no longer afford to operate because the risks were too high. Yeah, so the impacts they're real and they're with us now.
They're huge, yeah. So yeah, we have to definitely prevent and do something, right? So yeah, thank you so much for your insights, Bill. I think it's clear that preventing these fires, just like restoring peatlands and mangroves as well, they can show us how adaptation and mitigation also can go together as well.
Yeah, we need both.
We need both, definitely. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want to add? Or
adaptation really was sort of the ignored cousin.
Yeah.
For lots of reasons, because everybody wanted to focus on mitigation.
Yes,
and then,
that's right.
Countries, including my country, they don't want to talk about reparations. Places like, particularly like if you look at Pacific Island and that, they're saying, well, we didn't put all these emissions out there. We didn't cause sea level to rise and all these storm surges, but now we're losing our country. So they're saying we should get some reparations. They're right, but nobody wants to pay. At least not the rich countries that have made most of. My country is one of them. We're very high emissions per capita. We live in a cold country. We burn a lot of fuel.
All right. So Bill, thank you so much for our conversation today. I think you gave so much insights on climate adaptation, all the opportunities, all the risk, and what's happening in Indonesia with all the examples. I think it gives a really great highlight that now we know that there's so many challenges, but also so much opportunities, and we need to find the right financing and the amount of financing to support all these adaptation projects to support Indonesia and the world in general. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thanks, Ira. Enjoy being here.
Nah, teman-teman cendekia iklim, kita sudah banyak nih yang kita bahas hari ini. Kita telah belajar bahwa adaptasi iklim itu tidak hanya melindungi kita dari climate risk, tapi juga bisa membawakan banyak peluang. Juga bisa merestorasi lahan gambut dan bakau, bisa safeguarding juga masyarakat dari banjir maupun kebakaran, dan juga bisa memberikan peluang ekonomi termasuk lapangan pekerjaan. Diskusi hari ini dengan Will Duggan juga menunjukkan bahwa mitigasi dan adaptasi itu bisa dilakukan bersamaan. Dan jika dilakukan dengan benar, maka bisa membawakan juga banyak benefits dan co-benefits. Dan memberikan manfaat untuk manusia dan juga bumi. Dan dengan adanya Indonesia yang bertransisi ke ekonomi hijau, adaptasi ini akan menjadi penting dalam memastikan ketahanan, inklusivitas, dan juga keberlanjutan. Semoga episode hari ini membawakan banyak inspirasi, minat, dan aksi untuk adaptasi iklim. Terima kasih telah mendengarkan obrolan kami. Inilah Ekoniklim dan sampai jumpa di kesempatan berikutnya.